Hello, friends. This is the Netarts Friends Church podcast. We are Jesus people, Kingdom of God people, welcoming, yearning, sharing. And we're glad you're connecting here with us. We'd love to connect in person as well. If you're inclined to support this podcast or for more information, just hop on over to netartsfriends.org. That's netartsfriends.org. Let's jump into today's sermon. Along for the ride. How many of you recognize this ride? It's a family trip that we took to Disneyland. The ride is Space Mountain. Life takes you on all kinds of rides. And on some rides, things go from fun and happy to wishing that there was a button that you could push that stopped the ride wherever it was at and just let you off. But we all know that there are a lot of situations, there are a lot of rides in life where that's not the way it works. You get on and you are along for the ride, and it's even worse when it's something that you weren't sure about to begin with, something that you thought was probably ill-advised. You saw the red flags, you saw the warnings, you knew it was risky, you knew it was a bad idea, you guessed that things were probably headed for a crash, but you weren't in the driver's seat. And so now you're along for the ride, and you're stuck on the bad road trip. You're going down with the ship. It's when someone in your life chooses a destination that you wouldn't have chosen, and they head directly into a storm. The storm doesn't just swamp their boat, it swamps your boat, because you're along for the ride. So it's the family member who gets into a bad relationship that everyone said not to get into, and now the entire family is dealing with the mess and the aftermath and money troubles and trying to take care of kids and housing, etc. Or it's a family member whose spiritual, emotional, mental, physical health just takes a major downturn. It's something that you didn't choose, and even if they aren't to blame, it's the way you experience it is you're along for the ride. Or it's the company that you work for. They choose some new target markets that they want to pursue. You think their roadmap for getting there is ill-advised, but you're not the one steering the ship. You are along for the ride. And suddenly the storm is on top of you. The investments are going belly up, and now they're having to restructure and downsize and lay people off, and you are afraid you're going to end up without a job. It's co-signing for a loan for a friend's new business venture, or going on a vacation that someone else planned. It's any experience where things take a sudden dip or twist or turn, and you realize, I didn't sign up for this. This isn't what I thought it was going to be. I want off this ride. But there's no magic button that gets you off the ride. You just have to hold on for dear life, praying that you live through it. And the experience is even worse if you thought it was a bad idea to begin with. If motion sickness was the worst possible outcome, everything might be okay. But people who are just along for the ride sometimes lose a lot more than their lunch in real life. They lose relationships, friendships, all their money, all their profit, their entire savings, their home, their car, their job, their sleep, their health, their safety, their mind, sometimes their life, along for the ride. So we had a handout that we used to do some journaling and self-reflection in our Sunday gathering. And so as I kind of present these questions, I would invite you to maybe grab a piece of paper if you are able to, and maybe just do some of your own self-reflective writing. Here's the first question. What are the experiences that have taken a sudden dip, twist, or turn, and you are realizing that you didn't sign up for this and you want off this ride? What's the situation where you feel like, I didn't choose this destination and this project is ill-advised and you're being asked to cross over into territory you don't want to go into? You don't want to venture into these dangerous waters. So take a moment and reflect on that. The Bible does not portray a God who is behind every catastrophe. It doesn't portray a God who sends every storm that hits us. Far from it. The Bible paints a picture of reality where humanity is constantly experiencing less than God's best for us. Things happen all the time that are not the will of God. The suffering that we experience is the result of an infinite number of variables in this complex universe. And in the midst of it, the uncontrolling love of God is coming to you, guiding you, permitting, restraining, overruling, limiting choices to help you become the best version of yourself, and ultimately looking towards the salvation and the restoration of all creation. This brings us to two different stories. They are both along for the ride stories. They are told by the same person. They're told by Luke, and they are both stories about riding out a storm at sea. They're both stories about people who thought they were going down with the ship. Now, the first story is a story that Luke received from eyewitnesses, meaning Luke was not along for the ride in the first story. He just heard it from people who were along for the ride. It comes from Luke's first volume, Luke chapter 8, verse 22 through 25. The second story is Luke's personal story. He was along for the ride. You'll notice that throughout the entire story, he uses we language because he's along for the ride. Luke was the Apostle Paul's traveling companion, and this story comes from Acts 27. Now, both stories start out with an element that sounds like a bad idea. It sounds like something ill-advised. So I'm not saying it is a bad idea. I'm saying to the people in the story, it sounded like a bad idea. So in the first story, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." And so they got into a boat and set out. And as they sailed, Jesus fell asleep. Now, in this case, the other side of the lake was an area called Decapolis. It was the region of the Gerasenes. The people who lived there were not Jewish. They were considered outsiders, a thorn in the side of the Jews. And so when Jesus is saying, let's go to the other side of the lake, he's saying, let's go break bread with foreigners. Let's go across the border, which is crossing into Gentile territory. It's where they raised pigs and ate unclean food and worshipped other gods, were regarded as sexually immoral. It wasn't a destination the disciples would have ever chosen. To any upstanding Jew, this would be heard as saying at some level like, hey, let's all go to Ickyville. And they probably wouldn't want to go. It was ill-advised. But Jesus chose the destination, and then he just tapped out. He fell asleep on a cushion, exhausted. So what do you do when Emmanuel, God with us, is sleeping with us, snoring? drooling into a pillow, tapped out. The disciples were just along for the ride. In the second story, it also has a bad idea. So the Apostle Paul was a prisoner of a Roman centurion who was bringing him to stand trial before the Roman emperor, and Luke was his traveling companion along for the ride. They were sailing in the Adriatic Sea south of Greece and Italy. They were trying to make it to a safe harbor to spend the winter, and because of the time of year, the sailing had already become quite dangerous, to the point that the Apostle Paul was warning everyone that the voyage could bring great loss to the ship, the cargo, even their own lives. But nobody was listening to Paul. He was just a prisoner. And so both the Apostle Paul and Luke were just along for the ride. So I invite you to pause here for a moment and just consider your own story. Connect with your own discomfort with the chosen destination, whatever that means to you. What is your counter reasoning? What are your red flags? What are your warnings? And where have you felt those in your body? We did a body prayer in our Sunday gathering. Have you felt that as a tight chest, a dry mouth, an upset stomach, a tight back, a tight neck? Where have you felt that? In both stories, a furious storm broke out. The stories use descriptive language like a violent shaking of the sea, intense, unusual, a hurricane, a wind of hurricane force swept down on them. In the first story, their boat was being swamped and they were in great danger, and the disciples woke Jesus up. They shouted, "Master, Master, we're going to drown." In the second story, Luke says that they had to pass ropes under the ship to try to hold it together. He mentions them praying, and he says, "We gave up all hope of being saved." So what about you? What is it about this storm that you're facing that makes you feel like I might not survive, we might not survive? Take a moment, reflect on that. When the disciples woke Jesus up in the first story, what were they hoping he would do? Help them bail water out of the boat? Or were they thinking that he would pray for them? What were they expecting? The boat was being tossed about like a child might wildly toss a boat in a bathtub, and somehow Jesus managed to stand up, and he said the very same thing that he had said to so many demons. "Quiet, be still." And in a moment, the wind died down. The waves smashing the boat rocked themselves into a gentle calm. The rain stopped. The moon peeked through the clouds. And the moment was so shocking that the disciples could hardly gasp. The lump in their throats grew to the point they felt like they could hardly breathe. Jesus turned towards them, and I like to imagine a smile on his face as he asked them not a judgmental question, a curious, compassionate question. "Where's your faith?" They stared open mouth at the lapping water that moments ago had threatened to drown them. They stood dripping wet in the sloshy boat bottom, clutching the mast and the sides of the boat. They didn't know what to say to Jesus. They were speechless. Jesus had spoken to the howling wind and the drowning waves. much like someone might stick their head out the back door and yell at a yapping dog, "Be quiet!" Or like you might holler at the kids if you're trying to sleep in on a Saturday morning and they have the TV turned up to the max watching cartoons at 4:30 or 5 a.m. in the morning. Be quiet! And the wind and the waves obeyed him. First one disciple, then another began to scoop water out of the bottom of the boat. No one said anything to Jesus. Quietly, with heads reeling, they whispered to one another, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him?" None of them had been greatly schooled in the Old Testament scriptures, but they knew the stories. Yahweh, God, was the one who separated the waters in the creation story. Yahweh was the one who parted the Red Sea at the exodus of Israel from slavery in Egypt. Yahweh was the one who parted the Jordan River as they walked across into the Promised Land. Yahweh was the one who calmed the storm when Jonah was thrown overboard. Yahweh was the one the Psalms claim stilled the roaring seas. Yahweh was the one Isaiah said dries up the sea with a mere rebuke. And in a panic, they had woken up this man, Jesus, shouting at him, "Master, we're going to drown!" But now their master had done something that they knew only Yahweh could do. It wasn't a parlor trick. It wasn't a coincidence. This was their lake. They were fishermen, many of them. They had sailed it all their life. They knew these storms too well. So pause here, reflect. Have you ever experienced a storm being calmed in a way that only God could calm it? What happened? Before I tell you the second story, I have to wonder how many times Luke thought about the first story while he lived through the second story. How many times did Luke wish that Jesus was on his boat and that he could shout and wake Jesus up? How many times did Luke try screaming at the wind and the waves what Jesus had said to the wind and the waves? "Quiet! Be still!" Only to get another face full of stormy water. In the second story, things went from bad to worse, not from bad to better. Luke calls it a wind of hurricane force that gave them a violent battering. There was no sailing. They were just driven along across the sea, and there was no magic button that stopped the ride. The storm raged for 14 days with so much intensity they were in constant suspense. They didn't eat. They got very little sleep. They were holding on for dear life. There was no letting up. They threw all the ship's cargo and tackle overboard, all of their grain, which was all of their profit, to try to lighten the load. They had to cut their lifeboat. They had to just let the storm take it. Luke says that they prayed for daylight. He says that when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Now that's a really big statement coming from Luke. We finally gave up all hope of being saved. This is the person who interviewed all the eyewitnesses to Jesus' life and wrote down all their stories. This is the person who heard the disciples tell about Jesus calming the storm. And the we there is not just Luke. This is the Apostle Paul as well, giving up all hope of being saved. The Apostle Paul, who usually seems like he's not afraid of anything or anyone, they gave up all hope of being saved. Did they come to think no one up there is hearing us? Nobody up there cares. No one's coming to save us. We're going to just go down with the ship. How often does your story feel more like the second story than the first story? The storm doesn't last just one night. It goes on for weeks or months or years. You become exhausted. You lose sleep, lose your health, your strength deteriorates, lose all your profit, everything you had to show for your efforts. You lose all your lifelines, and somewhere in there, you might lose all hope. It's an awful feeling to lose all hope. To say to yourself, there's no magic button. No one is going to stand up and tell the wind and the waves to be still. I'm just out here alone, and I'm going down with the ship. That is an awful feeling. So pause for a moment here and think about your story. When have you lost all hope? So the question is, if Luke drowned at sea, how did we get this story, this second story, the book of Acts? Well, he didn't drown. He lived to write about the experience. The situation was horribly grim. The stern of the ship was broken to pieces by the pounding surf. At one point, the soldiers were planning on killing all the prisoners to prevent them from escaping. Everyone had to swim for it. The ship was a total loss, but Luke and the Apostle Paul and every other person on board somehow made it safely to land, and they flopped on the sand of some unknown island, soaked, shivering with cold and exhaustion, without any shelter, as the rain pounded down and the waves still lapped and swelled at their feet. And sometimes that's the way life feels. It's like even if you make it out of the stormy seas, even if things quote unquote work out, all it really means is that you're not dead yet. You're barely alive because you lost everything. You feel like you're reeling from exhaustion and so much loss, and you don't know how anything is going to work out. How can we have two stories from the same author that are so different? They are both storm stories, and yet they're so different. The storm subsided, all was calm. The stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. It's very easy to see the hope and the faith in the first story. And if every storm story in your life included Jesus waking up and telling the storm to calm down, it would eventually be pretty easy to have faith. But what do you do when your story feels a lot more like the second story, and you look at your life and your boat and you're like, man, my boat is getting broken to pieces? Does the second story have any hope in it at all? So I want to help you notice the rays of hope shining in the darkness of the second story. One of the rays of hope is that there are no human heroes in the boat except Jesus, which may not sound like much at first. The miracles that happened in both these stories happened in the midst of people being afraid and losing all hope, which begs the question, do miracles sometimes happen because we lack faith, not because we have faith? The disciples thought they were going to drown. Luke and the Apostle Paul gave up all hope of being saved. There are no superheroes in these stories, so there's no need to compare yourself to a Bible character, whoever you think they may be, who you imagine is a superhero, because they're all only human. And the reason that this is a ray of hope is because if you find yourself in a complete panic in a storm, completely exhausted, feeling like I've lost all faith and I've lost all hope, you aren't weird. You aren't a bad Christian. You're human. You're in good company. And you're standing with the 12 apostles. You're standing with Luke the doctor. You're standing with the Apostle Paul. The same Jesus who didn't abandon them in the midst of their fear and their hopelessness isn't going to abandon you. It's enough to be as hopeless as you are and yet to just seek God, to just pray, to just say, help, and see what happens. Another ray of hope. Receiving a word from Jesus. You can do your part of praying and listening for the word that Jesus is speaking, but at some point, that ball is in Jesus' court, which can be really scary. I wonder how long the Apostle Paul had been praying to Jesus before he experienced what he experienced on the boat. We don't know how long it had been, but we know the storm lasted 14 days, and we know that it had been long enough that he lost all hope. So, at some point, a messenger appeared on the boat, standing next to Paul after he had lost all hope, and the messenger said, "Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you." Now, Paul could have chalked that up to a hallucination, dehydration, sleep deprivation, starvation, exhaustion, and he could have said, "I'm going crazy." But he didn't. He received it as a word from Jesus. Sometimes the storm doesn't stop. And sometimes Jesus doesn't speak to the wind and the waves. Sometimes Jesus speaks to you, and you receive some kind of a word, some kind of an image, some kind of an experience from God in the midst of the storm. And it would be really easy to psych yourself out and tell yourself that word from Jesus is just a concoction. It's just a fabrication of your exhausted brain, and you could put that word aside and forget about it. Or you could lean into it. You could see it as a ray of hope. You could feel the hope. You could be reminded that you are not alone. The question in your story is this: however hard to believe it is, what is the word you have received from Jesus most recently? Take a moment and reflect on that. Another ray of hope is answered prayers. The story tells us that they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and they prayed for daylight. And then it goes on and says, when daylight came, they didn't recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground. Now, when things become desperate and there's no magic button and it feels like the situation just keeps getting worse, it's really easy to overlook the prayers that have been answered. Because you say to yourself, well, daylight doesn't solve drowning. So, almost like the answered prayer doesn't count. But those answered prayers just may be the way that God is with you and for you and suffering alongside you and saving you. So I invite you to pause here. Once again, slow down. Notice what prayers have been answered already in your life. Another ray of hope in the story is self-care. In the first story, Jesus is tapped out, and so he sleeps. And in the second story, it says Paul urged them all to eat. He said, "For the last 14 days, you all have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything, and now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." And after he said this, he took bread and he gave thanks to God in front of them all. And then he broke it and began to eat. And they were all encouraged, and they ate some food themselves. In the middle of the storm, God's care for you may come in the form of healthy food, laying down to get a nap, getting a workout, reading a book, going for a walk, getting some sunshine, calling a friend. And you may say, "That's not spiritual. That's not a miracle." But that's not how the Apostle Paul looked at the soggy piece of bread that he was holding in the rain. He looked at that soggy piece of bread as a reenactment of Jesus breaking bread. It says over and over in the Gospels, Jesus took bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, he gave it. And so he saw this reenactment. It was something happening that was very sacred and important. So maybe that walk, that nap, that workout is more important than you're giving it credit for. The question comes, what have you done recently in the middle of the storm to take care of yourself, to make sure you have the strength that you need? And finally, the brightest ray of hope might come through the human kindness of people who aren't even Christians. And this too is God's care. Acts 28. Once safely on shore, the islanders, Luke says, showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and they welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. He goes on, the chief official of the island welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. Sometimes what strikes us as unusual kindness, the fact that we think it's unusual might tell us more about us than it does someone else. The first thing that Scripture tells us is that we all are very good. We all are created in the image of God. We all have gifts about who we are. Without God in us, we wouldn't exist. We would fall apart. Scripture tells us that God is the one holding all creation today, holding it together. Quakers historically have called this that of God in every man. Now, this is not to say that there's nothing about people that is broken or regrettable or needs help and healing. We are better than we think we are and worse than we think we are. But some of the most beautiful and Christ-like words and help that I have ever received has actually come from people who also did not claim to be Christians, just like this story that Luke tells us, and yet the goodness of God was shining through them. And this can be part of God restoring your hope when you have lost all hope. When you find yourself on a ride that you didn't want to be on and you can't get off, you need this experience of finding God's kindness coming from a place that you didn't expect. And realizing God is at work already in every person. God is already at work in situations that you can't see. So, the final pause, the final reflection. Who are the islanders who have shown you unusual kindness? Is it truly unusual? And how is God using this kindness to restore your hope? Thank you for joining us for a Sunday sermon from Netart's Friends Church. We hope you'll join us soon for one of our in-person worship gatherings. For more information, hop on over to netartsfriends.org. God's peace be with you, friends.